We're going to get started. It's wonderful to see such a great crowd here for the 29th annual Rose Scheinberg Lecture. I first want to acknowledge that we are here on land that is politically designated as New York City and is the homeland of the Lenape-Hoking people who were violently displaced as a result of European settler colonialism over the course of 400 years. I'm Naomi Sunshine, and I'm chair of the Rose Scheinberg Committee. I want to briefly tell you about our namesake, Rose Scheinberg. She is a 1950 graduate of this law school and was a woman ahead of her time in many ways, and was motivated to go to law school by Red Scare activities in New York in the 1940s when she was a teacher, forced to limit what she was allowed to teach. To honor her memory, her niece and nephew, Jill and Richard Scheinberg, set up this committee and lecture series. Hopefully, Jill and Richard are with us on the live stream. We are very grateful to them for their ongoing commitment to this series. The Rose Scheinberg Committee invites a lecturer working at the intersection of gender, race, and class to the law school every year. And we've had an incredible lineup of speakers over the years. Many of their lectures are available on our website, and our introducers have also been incredible and accomplished radical activists in their own right. And I'll tell you a little bit about this year's introducer in a few minutes. But I want to get back to the other important thing you should know about the Rose Scheinberg Committee, and that's its structure. This committee is student-led. The students choose the lecturer and do much of the work involved in planning the lecture. I want to acknowledge and thank our current student members, 3Ls, Hamza Hussein, Kiana James, and Tanya Raja. And 2Ls, Tao Ho, Natasha Menon, and Ana Olivareta Trejo. They're fantastic, and I would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity while you are all here to do some recruiting. So, if you are a 1L, please look out in your email and on the docket. We are going to start the process of looking for new members to join the committee. It's a really important feature of our committee that it's student-led. That was by design and always brings new energy and ideas to our work. I also want to acknowledge the faculty members of our committee, Professor Brittany Farr, our newest member, lawyering Professor Madeline Fiore, and Sylvia Law, who is hopefully also with us on live stream, who was the founding chair of the committee and has been an incredible inspiration. I also want to give huge thanks to my colleague Zach Stewart, who's been instrumental in making this event happen. We also have an incredible group. We also have an incredible group of, I think, 25 co-sponsoring student organizations, which you can see in your program. So thank you to all of you on those organizations. A little bit about logistics. After my introduction, we'll hear from our introducer, Nicole Smith-Futrell, and then our main speaker, Dean Spade, who will share some more amazing wisdom. And then we'll open it up to questions. And after the lecture and Q&A, we will adjourn for a reception right next door in Golding Lounge for some food and drink and to continue the conversation. So now, finally, I'm thrilled to get to introduce you to Professor Nicole Smith-Futrell. She is an associate professor and co-director of the Defenders Clinic at CUNY School of Law. She also serves as faculty director of both the Center for Diversity in the Legal Profession and the W. Haywood Burns Chair in Human and Civil Rights Program at CUNY. Professor Smith-Futrell's career has been dedicated to advocating for the rights of those accused of criminal offenses. Her teaching and scholarship focus on criminal procedure, post-conviction relief, reentry, legal ethics, race and the law, and legal education. Her publications have appeared in the North Carolina Law Review, the NYU Review of Law and Social Change, a little shout out for social change, and the Ohio State Journal of Criminal Law, among others. Her recent work explores the relationships between carceral abolition and clinical legal pedagogy. She received the 2022 PEN America Writing as Activism Fellowship for her racial justice advocacy work and writing. Prior to joining CUNY, Professor Smith-Futrell was a public defender with the Bronx Defenders, where she litigated misdemeanor and felony cases and conducted criminal law trainings for new attorneys and local community groups. Before attending law school, she studied South Africa's post-apartheid criminal system as an Institute for International Public Policy Fellow. She currently serves on the Law School Engagement Committee of the Black Public Defenders Association and the Board of Directors of the Bronx Defenders. We're thrilled to have her here tonight to introduce Dean Spade. So, Professor Smith-Futrell, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction, and good evening, everyone. I am delighted to be here this evening with you all to introduce Dean Spade as this year's Rose Scheinberg Lecturer. And I have to tell you all, this is a really poignant moment for me. It has been a thrill to learn about Rose Scheinberg and to see the many luminaries who have contributed to this program over the years. Folks like Haywood Burns, Bernadine Dorn, Miriam Kaba, Joey Mogul, Linda Sarsour, Vince Warren, just to name a few. These are individuals that continue to influence all of us who aspire to do liberatory work. And so I truly cannot overstate what an honor it is for me to be here to introduce Dean, someone I have long admired for his radical and wide-reaching contributions to prison abolition, queer and trans liberation, and legal education. And I also want to tell you that I feel like I finally got the assignment that I have always silently been hoping for, to stand up in front of a room of people and let my complete and unabashed Dean Spade fandom fly and swing. Okay? I came this close to coming here to tell y'all that I'd be the president of the Dean Hive after this, but I refrain. I'll hold off from that. And to be clear, for those of you who are familiar with Dean's work, this is a very challenging assignment that I have in front of me. Dean stays working, right? Writing articles, books, zines, producing documentaries, creating workshops and collectives, and always organizing. Dean is tireless in his efforts to change the world, and I am going to do my best to sum it all up in a few short minutes. I first became familiar with Dean's work nearly 15 years ago, right around the time I was leaving my job as a public defender in the Bronx and making the shift to life as a law professor, teaching students in a criminal defense clinic. And I used to tell my students at the time that becoming a teacher after practicing as a PD had a kind of therapeutic quality for me. When you work on the front lines of the legal system, on behalf of poor people who are being criminalized, you see so much trauma, so much harm being done, families being torn apart, people losing their jobs, folks getting physically removed from this country. You see people getting thrown into cages and being treated as less than human. And even if you thought you had a critical analysis of how legal systems work before doing that job, you find that you have to fight like hell not to become complicit in it all. And it was only when I began teaching did I have a chance to unpack it all. But once you unpack it and lay it all out, what are you supposed to do with it? You have very little ability to change any of these conditions. And so I came to teaching really trying to process for myself what it was that lawyers could even do in these systems, and what it was that I was supposed to be teaching law students they could do. So when I started at CUNY Law, Dean happened to be serving as the Haywood Burns Chair for Civil Rights at the law school. And all of my students were buzzing with excitement because Dean was there and he was slated to teach poverty law and everybody wanted to take that class. And I remember thinking, now just who is this Dean Spade, person that everyone is so excited about? And I can still remember the looks on some of my students' faces and the exasperation. But I can say that I wasn't ignorant for long, because once I started to read Dean's articles and hear him speak, it felt like a light got switched on for me. Dean has a powerful ability to articulate the law's limitations in addressing issues of inequity and injustice. As law students and then as lawyers, we spend so much of our time being passive and obedient to the law and allowing our critique to only go so far as to allow us to tinker around the edges. But the message driving Dean's work is clear. We have to stop relying on the structures that are destroying us. Hoping that politicians or courts or philanthropy will save us has not worked, and it will not work. We can take care of one another and build new ways of living together. For those of us coming from the legal discipline, his work creates space and freedom. It gives us permission to move past efforts to improve the legal system and to instead focus on dismantling these systems, to work on doing harm reduction and collaborating with one another through mutual aid work. My colleague and teaching partner often used to lament that you give up your most radical self when you go to law school. But Dean inspires so many of us to maintain our radical selves, to use the law in support of organizing work, and to unlearn so many of the things about the legal system that we have always just accepted to be true. Dean's contributions to social, racial, and economic justice are immeasurable. And if we want to get to the point in the evening where I sit down and we actually get to hear from him, I'm going to do my best to share just a few of the highlights. Dean has been working to build queer and trans liberation based in racial and economic justice for the past 2 decades. He is the Patricia Wismer Professor of Gender and Diversity Studies and a Professor of Law at Seattle University School of Law, where he teaches administrative law, poverty law, gender and law, policing and imprisonment, and law and social movements. He is regarded to be the first openly trans person hired on a tenure-track law professor line in the United States. Prior to joining the faculty of Seattle University, Dean was a Williams Institute Law Teaching Fellow at UCLA Law School and Harvard, and a fellow at Harvard Law School. Dean is a graduate of Barnard College and UCLA Law School. And perhaps that is all I will say about Dean's work as a law professor, because I know that Dean has always chosen to resist the norms of the legal academy and to take on projects that allow him to be involved in social movements and make critical ideas more accessible to those who are inclined towards mobilization. Dean has effectively learned to operate in the space between law and organizing. He has been involved in countless organizing movements. He mobilized against Kings County in Seattle to stop a new youth jail from being built. He worked to oppose Washington State from expanding the Western State Hospital, a psychiatric prison. And he contributed to efforts to defund the Seattle Police Department. In 2002, Dean founded the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, a nonprofit law collective that provides free legal services to transgender, intersex, and gender nonconforming people who are low income and or people of color. SRLP also engages in litigation, policy reform, and public education on issues affecting these communities, and operates on a collective governance model, prioritizing the leadership of trans, intersex, and gender nonconforming people of color. Dean was staff attorney at SRLP from 2002 to 2006, during which time he presented testimony to the National Prison Rape Elimination Commission and helped achieve a major victory for transgender youth in foster care in the Jean Doe versus Bell case. He remained a non-staff collective member from 2007 to 2019. Much of Dean's work flags concerns about how nonprofit industrial complex affects activism. SRLP was intentionally designed as a collective with a non-hierarchical structure in an attempt to mobilize people and remain accountable to community needs, rather than a small group of lawyers working on big problems with limited tools. Dean uses his insights from learning and working with social movements and collectives to inform his work as a writer. As Dean is a prolific writer, having authored or contributed to numerous articles, essays, book chapters, and zines. In 2011, Dean published his first book, Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of Law. And a second edition of that book was published in 2015. Normal Life is an epiphany. It revealed the ways in which applying an individual rights-based framework of gay and lesbian politics could not serve as a method for trans survival. It shows how the lesbian and gay rights struggle for anti-discrimination laws, hate crime statutes, and inclusion through institutions such as marriage and the military excludes a large number of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people and maintains existing distributions of power. Dean's latest book, Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During the Crisis, This Crisis and the Next, was published in late 2020. Being in that moment of the COVID-19 pandemic and witnessing the uprisings to protest racist police violence, Dean's book was like a salve for the soul. We saw in that moment how our neighbors came together and our communities came together to take care of one another. And Dean explained to us that in that care, there is power. The point of mutual aid work is to mobilize people and to help each other survive existing conditions and to take bold action to end the extractive systems while building new social relations based on care and liberation. And Dean's writing is about powerful ideas and approaches, but he helps us understand how to do it. One key feature of Dean's work is its accessibility. From all of his writing and ideas, Dean has developed a host of toolkits, videos, and other resources focused on how to actualize the critical intersections of disability justice, prison abolition, and queer and trans liberation. Dean is doing the very unflashy and unglamorous but necessary work of teaching us how to create new ways of interacting with one another, new ways of managing through conflict, and new ways for us to survive and flourish. Now, I could go on about the list of awards that Dean has received over the years. He's received the 2008 Jesse Dukenminer Award for his article documenting gender. He was named 40 Under 40 in May 2010 by The Advocate. He was awarded the Barnard Center Activist Fellowship for his work for trans liberation, prison abolition, and using tactical strategies for left organizing. And most recently, he was named the 2022 Marguerite Casey Freedom Scholar. So tonight, I know we will get a window into Dean's brilliant thinking. There are important debates that are going on right now about the role of the state in providing basic human needs and how the state should be regarded in abolitionist visioning of the future. In this lecture, No Prisons, No Borders, No Cops, No State, Dean Spade will discuss why his work as a feminist poverty lawyer involved in abolition work for over 2 decades has led him to believe that abolitionists should take an anti-state approach. And so without further ado, please help me in joining to the stage, to the front, Dean Spade.
Seems like, can people hear in the back? Cool. That was very embarrassing. And also, if I could tell my 19-year-old self that someone as brilliant as you would ever read anything I wrote, I would be so moved. It's such an honor to be read by you. Thank you. So grateful to Naomi and Zach and Hamza and Kiana and all the people who have welcomed me here and Buell and worked on these events. Really, really grateful. Really delightful to be part of this conversation. I'm gonna put down my watch so I can see so I can make sure I don't talk for too long. And Sylvia, obviously, all the organizers on the committee. Really grateful. And I just want to pick up, where Naomi gave us a land acknowledgement that we're on Lenape land, and just, really encourage us to not have that be a formal part of the beginning of the event, but actually a way that we think about everything that happens in the rest of the conversation. It's central to my thinking about this question. So I hope we can like tie that in. Like any institution we're talking about in a law school or in any conversation about legal and government institutions in our context is about colonial institutions. And that should shape how we think about how we're going to change them, what we're going to do with people who are getting hurt by them, like how are we going to change that. Tonight I want to share like some really broad sweeping claims about that debate that Nicole was just mentioning, right? This question about how abolitionists should regard the state. So this is like, I'm trying to figure out whether there's a way to do this quick and dirty. And so really this is like that attempt, and it's just based on conversations I have with people who are like, we live in a context where anti-state thinking and work has been like severely and brutally suppressed and repressed for hundreds of years. So it's really hard to find out about it, and most of us don't know anything about it. And there's a default assumption that we're trying to like get our people elected and run the colonial government, and that I think is a terrible idea for all the reasons I'm about to say. So this is just like why that's important for abolitionists, and like what some of my conversations about that look like what people come back with, and then how I answer that. Like, that's all this is. And I can't wait to hear what lands on you all and what doesn't, and what you think about it. So I'm coming to this conversation especially from the work we've been doing, particularly since June 2020, on when the kind of abolitionism to some degree mainstreamed, and a lot more people got involved in what we call defund campaigns in their local jurisdictions, in their cities and counties. And that is like trying to reduce the police budgets, or at least stop their expansion, because they've expanded every year that you've been alive and that I've been alive. Trying to reduce the actual number of cops on the streets, trying to stop the adoption of new surveillance technologies by the police is often what the campaigns look like. Trying to move various services like parking enforcement or emergency response out of the police department. There's a lot of pieces to it, but we call all of that often like defund work, or that's being done by people who are trying to defund the police, shrink it in every way, get them off the streets, take the weapons out of their hands. And these experiments are revealing a lot of important tensions about how abolitionists regard the state. Like when we talk about this often as a divest invest structure, like, stop putting the money towards the cops and put it towards what people need, like housing, childcare, healthcare. Like that's kind of the way the way the talking points go. Makes perfect sense. Stop doing everything that hurts people when people don't have all the basic things they need. If we're supposed to be safer, what would make us safer is being housed, having childcare, healthcare, et cetera. It's like very simple. But one of the dilemmas of it is do we actually think the government should be how we get that stuff? Should the government be how we get housing, childcare, and healthcare? Do we think that they do a good job with that? We also, can they provide those services justly? What does the history of social welfare tell us about that? What does the history of living under colonial governments tell us about that? Is the United States itself a legitimate means for organizing care and infrastructure? And if, as I believe it's not, are there other ways to organize care and infrastructure? How else have people done it? Especially people who've never been cared for but have had to live under the violence of this government, but also people throughout history, since states are pretty new. So how have people organized themselves to survive, not through governments? And another question inside this is do we have to agree to do abolitionist work together? Can we work together even if you're trying to get your people elected to run the colonial state and I'm trying to smash the state, but we all hate prisons and jails? Could we still work together? And where's the rubber going to meet the road for us? That's a really interesting question. When does that difference matter and when does it not matter? Right? Because all organizing is based in recruiting new people who don't yet agree with you on everything and haven't yet grown all the solidarities you'll hope they grow. You may just not want this jail built this year, and I'm trying to convince you to hate all the jails ever, and that's cool. We can still work together on this. So where does this get hard, right? So we're at this incendiary moment, which I didn't know I'd live to see, which is cool, in which there's yet another legitimacy crisis for the system of criminalization. Those don't happen that often in the U.S. They happen in, because of big insurrectionary uprisings. And there's also, a huge, terrible counterinsurgency happening. But this is an important moment to know what we think about these very fundamental questions, and those conversations are hard because of that long history of repression. So defund campaigns are really amazing for a lot of reasons. They expose the immense cost of policing. Like, most people don't know that 40 to 50% of their state and city and county budgets are just spent on cops and courts and jail cells and whatnot. And they juxtapose that with the unmet needs of housing, transit, childcare, and healthcare. They delegitimize policing. You know, they expose so many things about what policing actually is in your jurisdiction. And they mobilize a public debate about like what actually makes us safe and what people really want. That's really wonderful. They also tend to expose, like any city and county budget work exposes, like how totally disconnected city and county government is from the people who live there, how most of us don't have any relationship to that or know what's going on in the budget, how our cities and counties are run by chambers of commerce, police, and real estate interests. Like, you know, finding that out more and making that a public problem is an important, I think, delegitimization of the state itself. The defund campaigns can be a good entry point for organizing. Like, a lot of people who don't know if they're abolitionists or don't know what they think about whether they think there should be no cops might still be like, what, 50%? And people in my community don't have X or Y. You know, it's a good entry point for that conversation for people that directly affects you. It's like, this is happening in my own town. And I think they're one of the things that makes abolitionist politics material. Like, abolitionism isn't just like the dream that someday there'll be no cops on the street. It's like, no, right now, like, let's not have this thing be the use of the resources. Similar to site fights, like when we're trying to get certain jails or prisons closed, or, you know, don't build this police station, or don't build that new detention center or whatever, or efforts to decriminalize stuff, you know, also very material, like let's not have this thing be criminalized, or efforts to get cops out of schools. Like, all of these things are like immediate abolitionist inroads for new organizers, which is great. And they actually are pragmatic, right? Like, they change the likelihood that you're going to be hurt by a cop if there's just less cops out there, or if they don't have as much technology or whatever. And they create a space for people to build relationships and shared analysis that leads to, you know, more organizing and more solidarity. And I think that in some ways they obviously can be taken up by people who do think that it's possible to get abolitionist politicians elected and create governments that don't have police, borders, and prisons. I don't agree with that vision, but obviously tons of abolitionists think that that's what they're doing. I want to make a different argument, obviously. Mine is that capitalist, colonial, and racist governments cannot fundamentally be transformed by socialist or abolitionist politicians. Actually, they need half their budgets allocated to cops, courts, and cages, because that's the only way you can operate a system of illegitimate domination. Like, it's not like by accident that they spend all the money on the cops and cages and militaries. Like, you couldn't get us all to do this stuff and to live this way and to pay these rents and to go to these dangerous jobs and to breathe this poisonous air and drink this poisonous water unless you had a standing army of people to keep us in line. And that's what government looks like all over the world, so it seems really normal, but it should be really, like, shocking that they've created a system that requires that much enforcement, right? So I'm arguing that prisons, police, militaries, and borders, something a lot of people can agree we should get rid of in the conversation I'm having, you know, and soon everyone, are actually co-constitutive with the state form. They're not something that's optional in the state form. Like, you wouldn't have a country if you didn't have a border and a cage and a set of racialized others you put in it. You know, like, I think that it's, you know, and that the authority of the state cannot actually be maintained without those things. And so I want to get rid of the authority of the state. But I came here because I want to get rid of those things. And then I figured out, after being an abolitionist and a feminist and trans person, all this stuff, that I was like, oh my God, I'm an anarchist. You know, like, that's the order it happened for me. It could happen to you tonight. Recently, there was an episode of The Dig on which Gio Mar and Miriam Kaba were talking about abolition. And Miriam Kaba described the state function as the capacity to protect and redistribute. Like, if that's what states do, if you make it really simple, they protect and redistribute. And what I would say is that contemporary states protect private property relations. That's what they protect, which make it possible for a small elite to extract the most possible from the people on the planet. It's an extractive, like, what they're protecting is an extractive set of relations. And what they redistribute is wealth upward. The entire time we've been alive, wealth has been further redistributed upwards. I don't know if you've seen these, like, videos on YouTube that show you, like, wealth is like they show you like U.S. wealth distribution, how much worse it's gotten in our lifetimes. But if you look at the global one, wealth distribution globally has gotten much, much more concentrated since the ostensible end of colonialism. Just think about that, how effective neoliberal economic policies are, that they've actually, like, wealth distribution is just like in our lifetimes on every level, globally and locally, right? To really think about, that's what the state form is for. It's not something that you use to correct that. That's my take on this. Okay, so, and then what it does is these institutions concentrate wealth and then protect that concentration from attacks by people from whom it was extracted. People who'd be like, stop doing this and we want our land back, we want to not work under these conditions, we want, to not pay rent to anyone ever again. So a lot of people on the left believe that states could become caregiving and could redistribute money downward. Like that's the fantasy, the socialist fantasy. It's like, oh, but we can have, Bernie will be president and the things will flow the other way. I always want to just ask whether those people are actually like anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist. You always want to ask that question. What demonstrates that? Anyway, but one thing a lot of people on the left think, and I think this happens a lot for people in law school. I teach administrative law, right? So one of the things people on the left think is that we need more government regulation. So the right is against government regulation, and we're for government regulation, and that's going to protect us from pollution and poisoning and labor abuses and whatnot and environmental harm. But in reality, what regulation does, government regulations just establish how much each industry can exploit, poison, and pollute you, while insulating bosses, landlords, and industry from liability and preventing us from stopping these harms and establishing different social relations. So for example, workers' compensation benefits, right? What they are established to do, is not to protect workers from being harmed at work. They're to establish a limit on how much redress workers can seek after they are harmed by the as dangerous as possible conditions created by bosses to get the most possible wealth out of you. Like they're the cap on what you can get, right? Another example of this that this always stands out for me is the law passed in California, AB 1054, after the utility company PG&E caused the deadly Camp Fire in 2018. You remember that really big fire? And right away, the state passed a law limiting the liability of PG&E for the fire. So to allow PG&E, which is too big to fail, to continue its negligent operations, which will cause more fires, right? Like the state is there to protect industry and let it hurt us, right? More generally, I would say we have like a broad court system that regulates the relationships between landlords and tenants and workers and bosses in a way that's really about forcing tenants and workers to go through a fruitless set of processes run by elites, judges, and lawyers, using individual claims and these rigged procedures where these wealthy judges determine the outcomes and the landlords and bosses write the laws. Like it's not, that system is not to have a place for us all to bring our claim. That system is to make sure we do our claims individually on conditions in which we'll lose, instead of doing collective action, right? Like they have made most effective ways of striking for tenants or workers illegal and often criminalized, right? So these processes are not like the place we get redress. These processes are the things that prevent redress, and they are always the thing that looks caring. Like, landlord-tenant law is hand in hand with like the cops being like, no, you will be evicted now, right? You will be crushed if you try to do collective action about this. So housing rights and workers' rights regulations are designed to redirect people away from collective action and away from rural and urban land and factory takeovers, fighting cops, squatting. I don't know if people have read Vicky Osterweil's amazing book, In Defense of Looting. If I could make all law students read one book, it would be that. Okay, there's a lot of books I put on the list. But anyway, it's really good. It's really simple, easy to read, clear, but like so brilliant. And she talked about these squadrons of people who would go around during the early 1930s and the Depression and stop evictions. Like a lot of people would show up and stop evictions. They just go to your house when you're about to be evicted and like fill it up and not let the marshal do its thing. And they stopped 77,000 evictions in New York City in the early 30s. Like it wasn't a few. Now we see those things are kind of one-offs. But like to think about the possibilities and also what people in other periods, like no wonder they had to create a New Deal, right? And the New Deal was about actually limiting and stopping all that stuff and creating like legit unions that would not wildcat strike. It's all about actually tamping down people's capacity for more disruptive and effective struggle. Oh, go take your claim to housing court. Good luck with that. So regulation is used to protect extraction and keep people subject to it. And as much of regulation, whenever we're in admin law and people think like, I'm pro-regulation because I'm left or I'm anti because I'm right, I'm like, what about immigration regulations? What about regulating people on welfare? Actually, like, so much of regulation is actually regulating people into criminality and exclusion. One more example I want to give, because this comes up a lot, working with different people who are trying to do different kinds of mutual aid projects. Like, you run into this thing with like healthcare licensure and like other forms of like insurance schemes, things that actually stop you from doing your own project in your community to like provide people counseling or other kinds of health support, because actually there's all these rules that are supposed to be like for the quality of your experience of those things, but actually are about like an industry keeping its corner. So if you're like a licensed therapist and you join a mutual aid project and offer people counseling, you are more likely to be like dinged on your licensure. You know what I mean? Like, these things actually are about preventing mutual aid and the social relations we want. Anyway, the other left or liberal fantasy is that taxation will be the way that the state can redistribute wealth and reduce inequality. Of course, I think we all know that taxes are just used for military criminalization apparatuses and controlling people and facilitating extraction. That's like primarily what they're used for. They always bail out the banks, they never bail out the tenants, et cetera. We know this. The kind of state infrastructure projects that taxation pays for primarily protect and support white life and white property values and displace and poison non-elites. And the purpose of this stuff is to sustain the private property relations that make people and the planet exploitable, make almost everything in our lives happen for profit, and prevent people from meeting our own needs. So the fantasy that taxation can be used like to make our lives better, it's the other way. Taxation's regress. I mean, it's obviously been used to create the very things that we all are suffering from, like the border and the prison. When governments appear to redistribute wealth downward, because there are moments they're like, oh, hey, have a COVID check, it's because it's a temporary concession to quell dissent and try to stabilize the status quo. There's so much of that history we can talk about more if you want to. And of course, governments they're functioning as designed, and that includes some level of flexibility and responsiveness. So sometimes they do grant concessions, or sometimes it looks like something that's good for poor people for a minute. But it's completely in their control to revoke that, to make it conditional, to exclude certain people, like undocumented people being excluded from COVID relief, et cetera. I come to this as a poverty lawyer, and I'm in the context of the U.S., so I'm mainly talking about the U.S. here, although I do think that these observations, could be thought about more broadly. Feminist, anti-racist, and disability justice movements in the U.S. and elsewhere have consistently shown that care programs, like things from the state that are supposed to be care, whether we're talking about the family policing system, aka child welfare, or social services, or income support, or disability benefits, are designed to police and punish marginalized groups and sort people into hierarchies of deservingness that justify stigma, abandonment, and premature death, right? Like, these things are not designed to like make us all well. They're designed to exclude certain people, to make certain groups of workers excluded, to make people excluded. They're heavily racialized, heavily gendered. And care systems often expand when we have uprisings. Like, the response will be some level of care system expansion. So, after the Great Depression, you get like an expansion in certain kinds of social welfare. But again, it's primarily for white, primarily benefits white men, like literally, in terms of who gets more benefits. And then it recedes. Oh my God, the COVID relief where they gave money to businesses and like hoped they'd give it to you, the worker. Like, that was the wildest ever. Like, not like the utter unwillingness to directly give people money is so outrageous because you can't be trusted, And then all of that just like disappears into the ether. And the most like forgiven like loans. Just wild, right? That stuff is limited. It's conditional. And it's revocable, right? And so it's just a response to get you to try to quell the uprising, and it always excludes the most stigmatized people. And feminists and disability justice activists have so much tried to ask us all to like look out for these like care-based and softer systems, right? I hope you've all read the book Prison by Any Other Name. That was such a useful intervention on this in the last couple of years that shows how electronic home monitoring and the family policing system and treatment, mental health treatment are all extensions of the prison, or looked at, there's so much work on this. Obviously the work of Dorothy Roberts on the family policing system is pivotal. But hopefully that makes us really suspicious of the idea of a caregiving state, because these care mechanisms are just other forms of prisons. I mean, what are New York City shelters like? They're jails. Like, they're just jails by another name. You know. Okay. Group homes, etc. Another piece of this, so that's, my piece looking at U.S. history and just being like, why would I think that a genocidal, colonial state built in chattel slavery could become caring? Like, why would that seem like the place to go for care? How has it looked when they've cared? But I think we can also have a deeper conversation about, and some of the people whose work I rely on for thinking about this are people like Peter Kropotkin, Peter Gelderloos, Dilar Dirac, and Modiba Kadali, and others, who ask some larger questions about, like, how did we even get states? Like, how did states develop? Like, that's really fascinating question to be like, how did we become organized this new way that is pretty pervasive globally? Like, there's a lot of, that's mostly what people are living under. And one of the things, when I summarize in this incredibly quick and dirty way, what I see them saying is that states are created when an elite conquers a territory, draws borders, invents internal and external enemies through racialization and gendering processes that invent populations that need to be cultivated and those that need to be abandoned or killed, right? So creating the fantasy of the immigrant, the all the racial categories, all the disability categories, et cetera, that tell you who's a monster, who's a drain, who's a threat, all of that, internally and externally. And then legitimizes practices that basically make it so that you're ruled by people you don't know. Like, what a state is people you don't know are setting the terms of your life. Like, that's what it is, And I don't think that could ever be done well, Creating states requires preventing people from accessing our own collective capacities to reproduce our lives and survive together. And we need to be rerouted through systems designed to benefit elite interests. This is also like another way of saying what capitalism does. These things, they emerge together, right? So capitalism is like, you need housing, you got to get it from the landlord. You need food, you got to get it through this brutal fossil fuel-based food system, et cetera. Like, that's like the state and capitalism, white supremacy, colonialism, all together, a beautiful braid that produces this utter dependency, right? And we can see this today. Obviously, we're all in a forced participation in a for-profit wage economy to meet our basic needs. And we're coerced into depending on the criminal punishment system for safety, even though we know it doesn't provide that. And supporting, like, everything we need, like healthcare or whatever, is to profit somebody. Like, we can't just get what we need. And we can't come up with it ourselves, because, like, I'm not allowed to, like, produce medicines and give them to you. And you can see this right now. Trans people are being criminalized for trying to distribute medicines to each other. And that's not new. It's taken a really long time to create these arrangements that are so endangering to our lives and to the future of human life. And people have resisted it all along. And studying people's resistance to state rule is such a helpful thing to do at all, because also it's hard to even see it. Sometimes, like, we're so used to it, so pervasive in our lives. What resistance movements want is collective self-determination. We want to decide for ourselves. Like, that's what we want. We want to be able to say, we don't want the energy that comes through into our lives to be from fracking or fossil fuels, right? And, like, right now, we don't have any say in that. You just, like, can pay for the energy or not, We don't want an education that's focused on making us into law enforcement, which is what law school is. We don't want any new prisons, any new dams, any new mines, any new pipelines, borders, right? We don't want to be taxed for wars and cops. Too bad. Right now, if you are criminalized if you don't accept those conditions. And also, you can't survive, right? It's very, very hard to eke out of survival. Although, it's very important to look at, like, people squatting and people looting and stealing and all the ways in which people have and continue to resist that. But for the most part, most people are pretty hooked in, right? More and more, I'd say, right? Rents are higher than they've ever been ever. There's more cops than ever. There's higher rents than ever. Like, it's not a coincidence. And, like, we're at, like, this ecological collapse moment. It's pretty deep. I'm just saying there's no chance that the solutions to all this is going to be coming from the thing that facilitates it all, right? This question about whether it matters. Can we work together even if I'm anti-state and you want to be part of the state and we're both abolitionists? I think that, we do all the time. And one thing I like about this debate that's currently happening among abolitionists is that it's pretty friendly. And, I feel like a lot of people, we're having very sincere conversations about it. Like, it's, to me, in my corner, it feels like people are like, oh, let's really dig into this in a generative way, because we've been collaborating together for decades, right? But I think there's kind of like, it's like up to a point we can like collaborate across this difference. Like we can be doing these anti-expansion, dismantling campaigns, supporting criminalized people, building mutual aid projects. But there are some potential rubs, right? There's like the moment where we debate how much time and resource should be given to electoral campaigns. Like that's a place where the rubber meets the road. We live in a society that tells you that's what politics is. So people get really pulled into electoral stuff. Even people who are like a little suspicious of it, like it's just so much of the oxygen in the room. Like maybe the answer will come. I live in a place where we have a social city council member. Let me tell you, we build jails like none other, you know? Just saying, it's like, doesn't really, I haven't seen it like work out. Enough for me to say I want to put my time into that. You know what I mean? And where we had a really amazing uprising and then all of our abolitionist candidates for city attorney and city council and stuff all lost, and we got actually like a Giuliani style scene right now in Seattle, you know? So anyway, so that's one of the places where we might like have a rub. Also, we might just feel different amounts of faith in the invest part. Like I engage in the defund work, and in that work, I'm happy to say all the talking points about how outrageous it is that our city and county money is going to the jails and the cops and not in the courts and not to the things people in Seattle and King County actually need. But I don't actually have any faith that like if the city put it towards housing, it wouldn't just like evaporate into sketchy nonprofits and like weird other capitalist. I mean, come on, like, it's, so like how much faith do we have in that part, and therefore where we put our time around that is like a question. We might take up the invest work to some degree as an experiment to see like what we can get as short-term concessions, but just like without a lot of faith that we're like building a new life where the city of Seattle, the colonial city of Seattle, like is going to give us the good life and everyone's going to be housed. That's not that. If everyone was housed, we wouldn't have to go to work at their terrible jobs. So they're never going to just do that, like because we come up with like a good report or whatever, or like a convincing testimony to the city council hearing. I still do constantly testify at those things because you just try everything, and it's an organizing moment really that's about us seeing each other, And there's a danger, right, that when we do the invest work, we're actually perpetuating the fantasy of a caregiving state, or maybe misdirecting efforts away from building autonomous survival infrastructure, because most people have never heard of that and don't know about that and aren't studying that. So how do we deal with the fact that like our imaginations are so populated with the pro-state stuff? And of course, just there's this deep wariness that hopefully we all have about nonprofitization when we imagine the outcomes of invest work, like our awareness that budget reallocations for survival needs will at best be funneled into nonprofits, which siphon for overhead expenses for basically elites usually, and distribute necessities in ways that perpetuate exclusions and stigma, and are limited by philanthropic control. If you haven't read the book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, edited by InState, it's just incredibly useful, especially if you have any interest in like changing the world and you're in law school, you need to read that book. Right, so it's just like, yeah, they'll create a housing program that nobody who has a felony can be, nobody's undocumented, and nobody who has kids or who doesn't have kids, whatever, all of the usual things. So we can have a lot of disagreement also about like about movement and tactics. If we have this difference, that I think it matters. Often, but not always, those who are interested in seizing the state are more likely to limit dissent, and those who are interested in eliminating governments are more likely to endorse disobedience, disruption, and attack. It's like the way Vicky Osterweiler talks about it. She talks about how the labor movement, as it like legitimized and became like organized into official unions, was less likely to do like wildcat strikes and stuff, and more likely to think like, we'll save it for another day. We're like looking at this long-term horizon, where when people are just like fighting for it right now and there's no one telling them wait for another day, you don't compromise in the same ways. I think that's an interesting point. Her stuff on labor is really interesting. Historically, disruption is what makes change, not negotiation. So, there's not a misunderstanding that has led to our oppression and domination. They know exactly what they're doing. Maybe not the individual city council members, but like the system knows what it's doing. So there's something really problematic about continuing to negotiate inside as if we can convince people. So I just want to give, my favorite part of this talk is this. I made this set of bullets. I'm like, how is abolitionism making, abolitionist analysis of the police and prison, what if we just applied that to the state? So these are the talking points. These are the bullets. as police and prisons are, so is the state. Built for domination, control, and extraction, not to keep us safe. Its purpose is domination, control, and extraction, not to keep us safe, just like the cops. It serves elite interests and masquerades as belonging to the people, just like the cops. It's actually working exactly as designed, so tinkering or fixing it is futile, just like the cops. Fantasies of it becoming caring prevent us from addressing its harms, just like the cops. People fear chaos, violence, and mayhem without it, just like the cops. Yet we know that it produces rather than prevents or addresses violence, and that shared practices of care and collective self-determination can better meet our needs than systems based in extraction and domination. A lot of people fear that life without current forms of government will be horrible, and they're really afraid that our projects can't be to scale. This is probably the question I got the most after I wrote Mutual Aid. It's but none of this can be to scale. They're worried about disasters. They're who will make the vaccine? Who will save us from disasters? First of all, I just want to say that to scale thing, we need to reimagine scale, obviously. It's decentralized resistance. If we're all doing a zillion mutual aid projects and we're able to experiment and make them cool and share what we learned and do them in a way that makes sense for our particular community and our language with our cultural norms or our region, that's actually way better than the state form, which is having centralized things that are distributed across all of Washington State or across the whole U.S., right, that are irrelevant, right, i.e. FEMA, i.e. COVID response. How's it working out with disasters? You know what I mean? How did it work out when they paid all the drug companies to make vaccines? We all paid for that, but we can't get the vaccines everywhere in the world. People need them. We would have made those vaccines without that system of profit getting in the way of its distribution. I believe people will always make vaccines. I believe scientists want to actually produce medicines. That's why they're in it, not to make drug companies rich. The idea that this is the best way to deal with disaster when this is creating all of the worst disasters feels outrageous to me. But that is a very common response I get to people talking about this conversation. Current systems already leave people without vaccines, without disaster preparation and emergency services. People, I believe, are more capable of collaborating, innovating, demonstrating solidarity, and saving each other without these systems in place, the military, the border, the for-profit healthcare system, whatever the case may be. I'll just finish by saying that it's hard because hundreds of years of government counterinsurgency have made most people not be very afraid of the word anarchism, have no idea what it means. There's this really ridiculous idea that it's a white and patriarchal ideology, which is completely erasing to all of the indigenous and black and immigrant anti-state organizing forever, who has had the most investment in organizing against these states. And so it's hard to get real information about what this politics is, and you're not going to ever learn about it in school or in the media, which is places people are looking. This moment requires us to really rigorously engage questions of the state, especially with the rise of particular forms of fascism right now. And we need to draw from anti-colonial and anti-racist and feminist analysis about what it means to reimagine infrastructure and care outside of centralized authority and domination. And if you're scared you won't get cared for without it, what's going on there? What lies have we been told that thing is caring, or that it could ever provide care, and that we can't? That's really disturbing. Abolitionists already follow anarchist principles of voluntary association, direct action, and mutual aid in our efforts to dismantle dominant institutions and build a new world. And we already do that through decentralized experimentation. That's what we've been doing unpaid forever. Now there's suddenly some money for this work, but it's, counterinsurgency. So the more vigorously that we can engage this question and take up the wisdom of past and present anti-state resistance formations, I think the better our chance, to survive at all, and to try to build the world that we're imagining. So I'm very curious how this lands on all of you.
Thank you so much, Jean. That was amazing. I know I have a million questions, but I will hold them, and I would love to hear your questions.
Or comments.
Yes.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for being here with us today. But I was really wondering your thoughts on, for example, what's going on specifically in Florida right now, where the state has become so entrenched in every number of institutions within specifically Florida, and also in communities. And it's become so hard to really reach out to these communities and be able to speak with them and educate and expose them to even like some of these ideas.
Will you tell me more what communities you're thinking about, what kind of entrenchment?
Yeah, so specifically I'm looking at like the education system and where they're banning a number of things, specifically in public universities. And I know from personal experience, like by attending a public university, I was able to be exposed to not just so much diversity in people, but also in like my education and literature and just so many different experiences. So how are we able, I guess, to go into a multitude of communities, whether that's marginalized communities or not in Florida, or just, I imagine this is going to be happening in so many other states as well, but go into these communities and be able to expose them to some of these ideas when the government is basically indoctrinating everyone to be against them.
Yeah. Great question. Yeah, and I think it's interesting when we see the rise of intense right-wing stuff. Sometimes that makes people even more desirous that we can take over the state and have that not happen. I see this a lot happening around like anti-trans laws, right? People are like, oh my God, we need to go contend with that in a certain way that's law-focused. And there's a couple things are a result of that. One is there's like this hand-wringing, like I'm going to sit in Washington and be like worried about what's happening in Florida can kind of happen a lot, where it's like I'm just watching this drama of what's happening between these lawmakers or between litigators and lawmakers or whatever in like the red states. That happens a lot. Very disempowering. It's very much like there's nothing I can do but maybe donate to the ACLU or something. I think it's really useful to think about how even when you live in a state that has good laws, the same things happen to people, right? Like, so I've lived in a lot of states like New York where supposedly trans people are protected from all kinds of discrimination, et cetera, and trans people are wildly incarcerated and being hurt in foster care and juvenile punishment and group homes of all kinds and psychiatric facilities. Like, the disconnect between law and reality. So there's a sideshow happening always around law, but the real show is like mutual aid and organizing, grassroots organizing. So one part of it, especially in situations like you're talking about, is counter-recruiting against the right. The right's recruiting people to its way of thinking. We need to be counter-recruiting. How do you do that? You organize on the ground in communities about people's basic needs. So if the right's trying to convince a lot of white, working class and poor people that their enemies are people of color and critical race theorists, we need to be organizing in those same communities and being like, oh, the enemy is your landlord, the enemy is your boss, the enemy is this terrible county planning commission that's poisoned us. Like that work, that's the counter-recruitment, right? And that's what people have always done. And the direct anti-fascist work, right? Like deplatforming Nazis everywhere they are. That piece of the work is so vital, right? And yeah, so we want to have that cultural debate, but that gets framed in a way that's incredibly state-centered. Like in reality, it's absolutely true that like bad laws can make things worse in people's lives. But even if those laws all get knocked down, like a lot of the laws they're trying to pass about trans people and drag and stuff like aren't, like they can't stand. But it's the cultural work of trying to pass those laws that's the problem, because then you like go to the welfare office and people are like, you can't be in here, even though that's not true, because they heard some transphobic stuff in the media for a long time. You know what I mean? So like these are really fights that are about local organizing and about being in real relationships with people so that they can't be recruited to these ideas and producing like real power. Like we're gonna, like if we had the level of mutual aid work that we need under these systems, we'd be accompanying people to every welfare office and every welfare hearing and every time people have to go to the hospital and every time people have to go to court. Not lawyers, because there's never gonna be enough lawyers for that, you know, but just like community projects, just packing courts, just accompanying people to everything, right? Like, most people have never done any accompaniment of any poor people who are in crisis to anything. They're just looking at Instagram being like, I've got these great ideas. So if we all were part of mutual aid projects and we were all supporting people, then those things, that's how we protect people from things. We actually personally protect and accompany and defend, right? Like, I think about this a lot I've been listening to this really great podcast called It Did Happen Here about anti-fascist organizing in Portland, Oregon, in the 80s and 90s. And they did a lot of home defense. Like, these Nazi people would like come after particular families and especially families of color, and then the cops aren't going to do anything about that, and so people would just like be at their house armed all the time. You know, like actually having each other's backs. That's the history of radical resistance. Instead of hoping we can convince the cops to become, or hoping we can convince the legislature to not hate trans people, like, you know what I mean? Like, a lot of people will always be drawn to that work. some set of elites will always be doing all that litigation and legislation work. Most of us, there's no role for us there except for as observers or maybe donating. So how do we produce the work that actually changes the day-to-day, So to me, the answer to all those things is organizing. And that includes, so we have a corporate media and then like a set of government structures that are always going to go towards the right stuff. Even if it's Democrats, it's all right-wing. It's all the same. They love war. They love to give tax breaks to rich people and corporations. They love to keep workers in their place. So how do we produce other ways of life through mutual aid, which is a central part of organizing because that's one of the recruitment strategies. Well, those people are giving out what I need. That's, the right does it. They give out some stuff people need to try to, they'll be like, let me babysit your baby at church while you read this horrible transphobic brochure. We need to, those things go together. So if we can provide each other the basics, that is how we bring people into deeper solidarity. And then people also get disabused of these notions. They actually are with people, with each other, and are like, oh yeah, you're also a tenant who's got a terrible landlord, and I was told to believe all these things about people like you, and now I see that actually we're in it together. That kind of building solidarity has been the history of social movements, and most of us have had that in our lives. Like you do social movement work and you find out all of a sudden you didn't know about who else is hurt by this thing. So that's how I think we think about this moment. It's like we need to decenter law in how we watch this story unfold. It's not irrelevant, but it's mostly a disempowering story for us, Yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. I feel like I have always thought of myself as like a really strong statist, particularly in the care systems that you've been talking about. So it's made me think about like a lot of what you're talking about. But I was curious particularly about your thoughts on like organizational structure, especially for like decision making and maybe like larger ideas or like decisions that have to be made in a community. Like you were talking specifically like about the electrical, like we want to choose where our electricity comes from, right? Like how would you make that decision? Like you can say collectively, but what does that mean? And then also how do you change something so big as an electrical grid? Like what does it mean when you don't have like democracy in this way? What do you think about that?
Cool. Yeah, totally. Yes. And I think it's really good to know we do not have any democracy. Right? It's so helpful to always remember that, like that's, of course not. Our entire system has been about excluding people from participating, about making sure we can only vote for two wealthy candidates who represent businesses, all of that. We've never lived in democracy here. You can't have a slave-based colonial democracy, those things, you can't have a democracy when the system is focused on concentrating wealth. So useful to remember that. And I also just want to say, like, I started this work as somebody who, like, growing up on welfare and was just like, I just want to help other people get their welfare benefits, and I want to make welfare benefits good. So I was very statist, and trying when I started this work, and it was only through doing it and being like, oh God, how does it work? That has shifted to me. So I can really relate to that as a very reasonable response to living under these systems. Naomi Klein is actually really useful, even though she's definitely not with me on the anarchism, about why we need small grids. And why we need community-run grids. And she has she's got some really great stuff about what's happened with the fires in California and how it all shows that, like, basically the centralization of authority in really large utility companies and the privatization of utilities produces all these different ecological crises, ranging from, like, fracking and coal to the fires themselves. And I think that the way she's thinking about that is also, it's about decentralization to be like much smaller grids that actually can be managed like appropriately by people. I'm just going to tell you about the world I fantasize about in case that's fun. So in the world I fantasize about, like the one that we would actually live in entirely, none of us would work for pay. We would have everything we needed because we provided it to each other, right? So there would be no, like, you must show up here and do this thing, to eat, right? Which is always an extractive thing and a for-profit thing. So instead, it would be like, okay, I'm part of the child care collective because I got kids and they go to the preschool, and I'm also part of the medic collective because I'm into that. But I can go to the food place and get the food. Like, I don't have to do everything in our community. Or I could be specializing in vaccines, or I could be specializing in, like, I put all my time towards the grid or all my time towards the sewage system. But I can get everything. People would be less specialized, right? They'd probably be a little bit more like, you do some other, like, we all get our hands dirty sometimes, or we do things more according to what we're able to do and what we're talented for, but it's not like, I'm the executive director of X and Y, and so I've never ever changed a diaper, the way it is now, right? Like the kind of, like, extreme specialization where some people do the most dangerous, dirty work and other people never ever touch it. You wouldn't be compensated more to be making vaccines than you would be to dealing with the sewage system or changing the diapers. right? Because everybody's getting some kind of housing and food and childcare and healthcare out of this. And that would be a lot of small collectivities, right? Like it would be a lot, and we all be involved in it. Right now, most of us like mostly just pay for stuff, you know, and don't, especially living in places like the United States, we do almost none of the labor to produce any of our clothing or food. You know, it's very distanced from us. We don't even know how it's produced, the computers we use, et cetera. So that would really shift. And also, if we're not living in a world bent on ecological destruction, we would not have as many of these things, like period. Like we would not have as many of these clothes or as many of these computers or as many hours a day of life perhaps, or, right, like that's just, this is not sustainable. We know where this is going. But it would be this other thing that's consensual, right? Like I get to have this stuff because I also participated in it, but it wouldn't be like anyone's enforcing that. Like, Dean, you didn't do your hours at the garbage, you know, processing, recycling thing, so you can't eat. It wouldn't be that. And I think the best way to think about this world is both to think about like the histories of people living in what folks call like gift economies, which gift economies were not like, I give you this and then in 20 years you need to pay me back. It was like, oh, we all need to fix your fence because it needs to be fixed, and we all need to, your house burned, we all need to rebuild it. And it was, people weren't keeping track. It was just like, oh, everybody wants everybody to live. Right now everybody's in competition to live, but I think people actually, dare I say, naturally are actually collaborative, and that's how we evolved to survive. So that's one way to look at it. And the other place to look at it is science fiction. A lot of people really look to Ursula K. Le Guin's book, The Dispossessed, as a really interesting, especially around the world, like Would People Work? That's a really fun book for like Would People Work? I think that some of, I mean, there's so many, you know, so many ways to look at this. I have found some of Cory Doctorow's fiction to be useful, especially his young adult fiction. Some of it has been really useful to me, and he wrote a book called The Walkaway. I mean, none of these books are perfect, you know, but he wrote a book called The Walkaway or something that's an interesting like take on people walking away from like capitalism in the state and going to live on Superfund sites and like organizing to do things together, all based on consent and nobody's getting paid or paying. But yeah, trying to find ways to imagine that, and also just noticing where we're already doing it. Like for most of us, we're doing some of this in our friendships. It's one of the only spaces. Blood families kind of look a lot like they're such a vital tool of capitalism that they're pretty hierarchical and exploitative and extractive. But friendships sometimes are a place where we're doing something more consensual. Love and romance, very sticky in our culture, but friendship, I think, is a place where maybe we've practiced like consensual decision making. What does the decision making look like on the big scale? I recommend a book edited by Cindy Milstein called Deciding for Ourselves, which is an anthology that has a bunch of stories about people making decisions in really big groups. I found that book really useful. A lot of people look at the Zapatistas, they look at what's going on in Rojava. The book that Peter Gelderloos wrote called Anarchy Works has some really interesting examples, historical examples. But yeah, like part of it is people making decisions in smaller groups and doing things in smaller groups and then coordinating. And part of it is there's just lots of like clever ways to make decisions in really big groups through spokes councils and other things that are not about enforcement mechanisms, but about like people convincing each other, like and coming up with like, oh yeah, we could all live with that. Let's do it. It's worth it because we're all going to coordinate to do it. We couldn't do it by ourselves. So it's worth it to me to be like, okay, a little more like your way. I could live with that. Like people actually deciding to find enough consensus to achieve something, and also doing things in smaller groups and be like, we're going to do it this way over here. You do it that way. We'll compare notes. We might really disagree. That might be heated.